The Lisa was inspired originally by the Alto at Xerox PARC. Steve had wrangled a way to get over to Xerox because he was curious to see what they were working on, and he met Larry Tesler, who eventually came to work at Apple. And he was absolutely fascinated by the idea that you could have a user experience that was graphical, because Steve's vision for the Macintosh was that he wanted to focus on non-technical people. And non-technical people needed to be captured by the experience of using a computer, because they had no idea why would they even want a computer. And then he wanted the graphical user interface to be able to do things that were highly creative, like desktop publishing. So the Lisa was the first prototype to what would eventually become the Macintosh, even though they were technically different. The Lisa had a much more sophisticated operating system than the Macintosh did when it first came out. Lisa was intended to be a workstation more than a computer for the rest of us, as the Mac was positioned. Lisa was intended to have all the apps that you would ever need came with the machine, which were actually 7 of them. And they were all around task-based purposes. And Lisa was the first product that Apple prototyped that actually did desktop publishing. So in many ways, there were things that were done in Lisa that have more resemblance to what computers are like today, because Lisa was the first product that Apple introduced that actually had multitasking. It was the first product which was able to do integration of one document being able to be copied and pasted into another document, and it made that whole process really simply. It was before laser printers were practical, so it had to print out on a dot matrix printer, but it did have a hard drive. The first Mac didn't have a hard drive. It did have the SCSI port and things of that sort. So there were a lot of foundational technologies that were in the first Lisa. But when Steve Jobs was asked to leave the Macintosh group, this was, by the way, before I had joined Apple, so I didn't even know Steve at that point. But he was asked to step down from the Lisa team because he was causing some disruption, so I've heard. In any event, he took over from Jeff Raskin a project which was called Macintosh that was started in 1979. And the Macintosh was really focused on getting a product to market that would not only capture many of the metaphors of desktop publishing that came from Alto and Xerox PARC and prototyped by Lisa, but at a very, very different price point. And so the Mac had to leave things out that were in the Lisa, but the Mac did get to market, and the Mac obviously changed the world. Well, the Macintosh team and the Lisa team were very competitive. So Steve used to call the Lisa team, headed by John Couch, who actually was a very talented leader and a very talented computer scientist. But Steve Jobs called them the Navy, and he said, "We're the pirates." And by that he meant that he was willing to break the rules, because Steve was not an engineer, but he was tremendously talented at being able to recruit people who were engineers, but engineers who could invent things that didn't exist before. Andy Hertzfeld, Bill Atkinson, many of these engineers, Burl Smith, Steve Capps, were people who broke the rules. That's why they were called the pirates. And the Mac, in its first iteration, did not really have, many people who are engineers say, it didn't really have an operating system. It had a lot of tricks. And the reason for that was that the 68,000 microprocessor just wasn't very powerful. There were no coprocessors. There were no graphics processors. None of that stuff existed back in the days that the first Mac was being developed. And so there had to be compromises in the technology, but Steve didn't want to compromise the experience. And he did accomplish that, even though the first Mac wasn't nearly as powerful in terms of its foundational technology as the Lisa. It was a new price point. It was able to do things in an extremely appealing way. And it did become much more recognizable to non-technical people as something they would want to have for themselves. The Lisa was never intended as a personal computer for the individual. It was always intended as a computer for the professional, but at a price point that had never been even considered by Xerox at that point. Xerox had the Alto, which was a prototype. They then developed the Star, which was a product designed for commercial release, but the price point was going to be up in the $65,000 to $80,000 range, depending how it was configured. Lisa actually came out at about $5,500 and then $5,000 for the profile hard disk. And so it was roughly a $10,000 system in its first iteration. That clearly was not a price point for consumers. So it was never intended to compete with the Macintosh as a personal computer, the way the Apple II was a personal computer or the Mac was a personal computer. No, I was there for the first sneak previews of the Lisa, in New York at the Carlisle Hotel, and when people got to see it for the first time, before the actual introduction, yeah. But I wasn't there at Xerox PARC. Well, I first met Steve Jobs in the fall of 1982, and my first introduction to graphics-oriented computing was when Andy Hertzfeld had put a demo together. Steve had told the story that at that point I was CEO of Pepsi and I was thinking about making a big order for the first Macintosh, and so Andy mocked up dancing Pepsi cans on a Macintosh prototype screen. And I didn't realize that was a hard thing to do, but technically that was a very challenging thing to do. No one had ever done something like that before. But it wasn't until January of 1983, I still had not joined Apple. Steve and I were meeting almost every weekend for 5 months as we were getting to know each other, either in the East Coast or Silicon Valley. And in this case, Steve invited me to the Carlisle Hotel to see the first Lisa that I saw before the January 19th, 1983 introduction of the Lisa. And I was very impressed. And I got to see it at the same time that Steve was running a sneak program, John Couch was running a sneak program to show corporate potential buyers, what the Lisa was, and everyone was impressed because they'd never seen a computer like this before. I joined Apple on April 6, 1983 as CEO of the company. I wasn't involved with any of the development of the Macintosh or the Lisa because I had one high priority that the board of directors had given me, was that the only cash flow, positive cash flow for Apple for the next 3 years was going to come from the Apple II. Steve had banned the Apple II group from being on the Apple campus. So they were 2.5 miles away at the Triangle building. So I had moved my office when I showed up at Apple to the Triangle building and wanted to become the overall senior person working with the Apple II group to turn the sales around. This is a 6-year-old product. It was way behind the IBM PC in sales. It was outsold by Commodore and Atari 2-1. And we had to revive the Apple II because the Mac wasn't going to make any money for maybe 3 years. The Lisa wasn't going to make any money. It was pretty obvious by that point. So the Apple II was my priority for most of the first year I was at Apple. We did turn it around. We completely redesigned what the Apple II looked like with the Apple IIc, and we changed the whole dealer structure. We did a lot of things that were just plain old sales and marketing because that's the world I came from. And the Apple II became incredibly successful again, and it did generate lots of profits. In the meantime, Lisa was not selling. The corporate customers said it just wasn't capable of doing things well enough for what they needed. It was very, very slow. It was running on a 5 megahertz CPU processor, the first generation of the 68000 from Motorola CPU. And it was a disappointment. So it was inspiring to people because they saw what the future was probably going to look like in computing, but from a practical standpoint, IT executives and big corporations weren't willing to bet on it. Well, it's true that the Apple II did have to carry the company, and it is true in 1985 when Steve Jobs introduced the Macintosh Office at the annual shareholders meeting in Cupertino, that while it got a lot of excitement Steve is an amazing presenter, as we all know from the stage, and that was the first time that the laser writer was introduced and the first time that a complete desktop publishing solution was introduced. But the reality was we're still back at a 8 megahertz microprocessor, and just to raster a graphic image of some resolution on a Mac screen and then to wait for a PostScript to be able to build an image that could be printed out on the laser writer took many, many minutes for just one page. And people laughed at it. And they said the Macintosh office is not serious for computing. And Steve was so focused on this being a success that he became really depressed. And then he turned on me and he said, "John, it's your fault." He said, "You made me price the Mac at $24.95, and I wanted to price it at $19.95. And I want you to lower the price of the Mac by $500. I want you to move the advertising from the Apple II to the Mac, and that will turn it around." And I said, "Steve, I've talked to your engineering team, and they said the issue is not marketing. The issue is that it's just too slow. We're just too early to be able to do desktop publishing as promised in the Macintosh office." And this is what led to the breakdown between Steve and me. We both went to the board of directors. We each presented our case. Mike Markla, who was the third co-founder of Apple and was vice chairman at that time on the board, was asked by the board to independently go talk to the engineers, to talk to other people at Apple, and to come back and report to the board what he found by talking to these people, besides Steve and me. And a week later, another board meeting was held. Mike Markla came back and said, "I've looked at everything, talked to everybody. I agree with John. I don't agree with Steve." And the board subsequently asked Steve to step down. He was never fired. They asked him to step down from running the Macintosh group. He was still chairman of the board. They told him he could go work on anything he wanted to. He could start another group, that he would be fully funded for that. But he took a sabbatical, and then when he came back, he resigned and started next. Well, it was very important when we introduced the first Macintosh that we be able to explain, where did Lisa fit into all of this? Because the Lisa sales were not doing well at all. And so we incorporated the same 3.5-inch disk drive that we had in the first Mac, which was a Sony disk drive, into the Lisa. We dropped the price significantly on the Lisa. It originally was going to be called the Lisa 210, but it was actually introduced as the Macintosh XL. It was kind of a kludge, unfortunately, because the goal was to have a Mac emulator, in it that would run on the same 68,000 processor. But the Lisa and the Mac were completely different operating systems. Most people saw through that, and the Lisa sales still didn't sell very well. When we reduced the price of the Lisa at the time of the Mac intro, there was never any expectation that we would recoup any of the money. We knew that the development cost of the Lisa was so expensive, and even at its prior pricing, there was no way to recoup the cost of it, even the development cost. So we were essentially subsidizing it in order to keep the focus on the Macintosh, that the Mac was really the future of the company, but we didn't want to get people distracted by saying, "Well, you told us a year ago that the Lisa was the future of the company," back in 1983, before I came to Apple. So we didn't believe that was going to be a fix long term, but we said in the near term, it at least takes the eye off of this difficult to explain. Why did we say the Lisa was the future of the company in early 1983, and then in 1984 we say, nope, the Macintosh is the future of the company. So people would say, well, then where does Lisa fit in? It's so much more expensive than a Mac, and it doesn't do many of the things that the Mac could at that time. I think the important thing from my perspective looking back on the Lisa is that there were so many correct technical decisions that were made by the Lisa team. It's a superb technical team, and but it was too early. Just like Newton was too early, the first Macintosh was too early. Apple was willing to take big risks and do ambitious things, but often way ahead of the curve in terms of what was possible with the physics. We just weren't at a point where microprocessors were able to do the heavy lift that they had to be able to do. So the Lisa actually had a really good multitasking operating system in it. Woz has told me many times, even in recent years, he said that the Lisa decisions on operating systems were actually much better than the ones that were made on the Mac, but the decisions on the Mac were made for a different purpose. Steve wanted to get a price point that could deliver a great user experience, and he didn't worry too much in those days whether he had the right operating system. In fact, some people argue that there wasn't really an operating system. There were a lot of tricks, and some very clever engineers on the Mac group figured out how to make it look like a real operating system, but it was relatively thin in terms of its real capability. So over time, many of the ideas that were imagined and executed with the first Lisa found their way into the Macintosh. So Lisa did have a big influence over time on the Macintosh, but both the Mac in its first iteration and the Lisa in its first iteration were way too early from a physics standpoint. As everybody does in Silicon Valley, certainly back in the early days when, remember, the 80s was the decade of invention in Silicon Valley. I would say currently in Silicon Valley, no one really thinks of Silicon Valley today as the tool makers and the inventors. You think of Silicon Valley as the scaling of big platforms, as the era of content, the era of new kinds of services. But the era of invention was back in the 1980s. A lot of invention obviously originated with Xerox PARC. Then the next target of invention was the Lisa team, then the Mac team. But then a lot of the things that were well solved in the Lisa as microprocessors became more powerful, Moore's law, actually became very practical to be able to put into the Macintosh, and that learning curve was taken full advantage of. Steve Jobs wanted to cancel Lisa from the day that the Mac was introduced. He thought it was a waste of time. It was the wrong project. He thought there were some great engineers on the Lisa team, and he would have liked to have brought them together to work on Macintosh. And it's true that Lisa had some exceptional talent. John Couch, Wayne Rosing, Eric Ringwald, a lot of people who were very talented, worked on the Lisa. And if Steve had his way, there never would have been, a Lisa after the, first disappointment when it was introduced back in 1983. Well, it was never the sales were pretty good. Sales were just better than they had been, but it was not at a point, as you could say, if we just kept selling it, we could be able to work off the development costs of the machine. It just wasn't there. It was always at very low sales run rate, and it would never recover its development costs or its sales and marketing costs. Well, the considerations were not, what's the impact going to be on us from a marketing standpoint, because the Lisa was always positioned as a professional machine for desktop publishing for experts. It was never positioned as a consumer product. It was never positioned as a platform where developers would come and build applications on it the way they did on the Macintosh. It was a complete system. It had 7 different task-based applications. That's what it did. No one was out. We weren't running an evangelist group to go out and get other people to develop on it for an important reason. We had the Apple II. We wanted people to continue to develop apps for that, and we had the Macintosh. So we thought it would really confuse the world if we tried to support 3 different platforms from an independent developer standpoint. So I think there was a lot of agreement at the management level and the board level that we had to focus just on the Mac and the Apple II.
So ironic, isn't it? How how Steve Jobs kind of one way cost the company a lot of money and destroyed this other platform. But then, of course, he was responsible for helping save the company, kind of with the Mac. I mean, early on, and then of course when he came back, it's just weird, isn't it?
Well, Steve Jobs is absolutely the great genius that everyone imagined him to be. Many times people get remembered at being greater than they really were. The case of Steve, he really was as great as people want to remember him, and he made brilliant decisions about innovation. And I always love the definition of genius as someone who can see the obvious 20 years ahead of the rest of us. And Steve had that ability, and he made decisions that made good sense in terms of vision, but he was not an engineer. And in those days, they used to call it in Silicon Valley the Steve Jobs reality distortion field. And it was because Steve didn't feel bounded by the laws of physics. And so he often overestimated what was possible, even though he had this brilliant team. No one was better than Steve Jobs in terms of recruiting talent and getting them to do things. And he was an amazing taskmaster. He would drive people crazy, but at the same time they loved him and wanted to please him. And he was unique. He still is unique as a role model. No, I never had second thoughts about canceling the Lisa. I don't think anybody else did. And fortunately, some of the engineers went on to do other great stuff at Apple. For example, Larry Tesler became the head of the Newton team. Larry Tesler was the one who worked with Herman Hauser at Cambridge University to develop the ARM microprocessor. This became the first low-powered floating point processor that is built into every smartphone device today, including iPhones and Android phones. So the talent that worked at Lisa either ended up at Macintosh or ended up on Newton. In 1987, there are still quite a few thousand Lisas that had never sold, and financially, our CFO, Joe Graziano, said, "Hey, we ought to take a write-off on this, but they have to be destroyed." And so they were taken out to a landfill in Utah in 1987 and destroyed. I think today those Lisas are probably worth many times what they sold for at list price. And there are a few of them in the Computer Museum, and there are collectors of the original Lisa.
Oh, do you have any nostalgia for the Apple Lisa? Do you own any old computers?
I don't, no. I gave them all away to my son over the years. And I think he actually does have the original. He was at Stanford University, and he used his Apple Lisa at Stanford back in the early days, and he told me about a year ago he still has it off in storage. I think the Apple Lisa memories for me are so consistent with what Apple was like in those early days. Apple recruited people with insatiable curiosity. Apple's talent were largely technical in those days because they had to invent things that had never been developed commercially before. And they were big risk takers. And they were willing to work incredibly hard. People used to wear T-shirts, working 50 hours a week and loving it. And the culture of Apple was so well represented by what happened at Lisa, what happened with the Macintosh team, what happened even in the final years of the Apple II with the Apple follow-on products that actually kept the Apple II as a big seller throughout most of the 1980s. So the culture was very similar between each of those three groups, Lisa, Mac, and Apple II. I didn't really have much
That was before you too.
Insight on the Apple III. The Apple III was introduced, I think, in 1980.
Yeah.
It didn't succeed. It still sort of hung around. It had a it had an Apple II emulator in it. Didn't really ever catch on, and it just wasn't a priority in my era.
Gosh, I'm gonna keep asking stuff, but I think that's pretty good.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Yeah, I think we got it.
Excellent. Good luck.
Thank you.